And ultimately, that meant a lot of frowns for Mavs fans as they fell 137-120 against the Pacers yesterday. It's the Get Right here on 105.3 The Fan. Does Jason Kidd need to be on the hot seat? We'll discuss it right now. My name is Reginald Atatula. I'm talking with the three-time Hall of Famer Chris Arnold. You can always get involved by texting into the truckwreck.com text line 877-881-1053. Now, CA, this was another tough loss against the Pacers, and one of the things that was, I think, frustrating for me, and you were listening, obviously leaving the AAC after your duties, emceeing as the host with the most at the AAC for the Dallas Mavericks. You were listening to myself and Blake, and just I think the utter frustration. I wonder if that came through with this loss, because this is a team that you played the Pacers just over a week ago, last weekend, not this weekend that just passed, but the weekend prior. And it looked fairly similar. And so it was very frustrating to see you play the same team. And I guess in theory, you play the same team, same results. How surprising is that? But it's like you had recently seen them, and you would hope that you would have found some level of, answers or trending towards answers. And you saw this game, and it looks like, no, the same issues that you had against the Pacers then, and that seemed to plague you throughout the week in some ways, came back around. And look, there's a lot of places to point at, but when we talk about a head coach in these sports, the idea of responsibility comes up. And Jason Kidd is responsible for this team. And so I think over the last, the last 6 games where they've lost 5 of those 6, I think a lot of people look up and go, man, it is getting tough with these Dallas Mavericks. Jason Kidd has to have a level of accountability. I'll start here. Like, where do you stand on just the idea of Jason Kidd being on the hot seat?
I think hot seats in any sport, whether it's basketball, football, baseball, hockey, whatever it is, a hot seat for a coach is based upon the expectation level.
Okay.
Whether it's going into the season, whether the expectation is where they are now, maybe this past trade deadline, the moves that were made, a 7-game winning streak, the shock that it just completely flipped, losing 5 of their last 6 games. So, of course, that's what a hot seat's all about. I think he knows his situation. I'm not saying I think he's going to – I don't think he thinks he's going to get fired, or at least he knows if they don't do something in these 20 games. See, that's one of the things. You got to say, how did you lose these games, or how did you win these games moving forward? It's how they – in other words, this past offseason, I'll give you the Cowboys, for example, with Mike McCarthy.
Yes, sir.
Going into the season, I said, Mike McCarthy is on the hot seat. And guess what they did? They started winning these games and looking good. And then there was a lull. 49ers game, he's back on the hot seat again. Wait a minute. They're reacting. The players love McCarthy. And then it's like, okay, they're 12-5 again. Let's see how they do against Green Bay. And I was saying, it's how they play. That's going to determine, because at first it's like, they better get to the conference championship game. And it's like, okay, well, it depends on how they play. They sucked in the playoffs. So, boom, 1-year deals for all the whole coaching staff. So, again, it's about what's the expectation level and how do you see improvement. I could go on and on and on.
Okay.
But, yeah, if everybody wants him to be on the hot seat, he's on the hot seat.
I think that it's interesting.
I'm talking about the fan base.
No, I hear you. And what's funny is it's very clear that Jason Kidd doesn't care a ton about what us on the outside view of this, but
he's trying to focus on trying to win these games and make sure those players don't ever quit on him.
And that needs to be his focus. And it is worth saying, right? Absolutely. Right. That is one part of the coaching aspect that he seems to have. Those guys still seem to like playing for him, particularly your star players, Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving. All right, but let's at least allow me to try and make some of this case here. You mentioned the idea of expectation and improvement, and I think that you're very right in that, right? Especially as the way that this Mavs team is, you're trying to build yourself to a place where now, as opposed to being some level of good team, you are a perennially good team, a team that is constantly in the playoffs, and a team that could contend ultimately for a championship. And I look at this team, and progress is a real question. In a couple of ways. One of them being Grant Afseth, who covers this Mavs team. He put out a stat that I found to be kind of fascinating. We talked a lot about how, I'll just read it, right? He mentioned who has the worst defensive ratings since the All-Star break.
Mavericks.
Your Mavericks are squarely the 30th team, and there are 30 teams in the league with a 126.0. In fact, the next closest team, the Washington Wizards, that we make fun of as being a wholly unserious team, is a 122.6 or 122.5. 3.5 points worse when it comes to defensive rating for your Dallas Mavericks since the All-Star break. That includes a long period of time with you having, or a decent amount of time with you having your new team and your bigger guys and these things. And defense is Jason Kidd's focus. Now, it's not as, polar as maybe the NFL, where you go, that guy came up as a defensive coach, that guy's an offensive coach, but he is more of a defensively focused team. He was the defensive
coordinator for the Lakers when they won the championship in the bubble, and he's always been all-team defense when he was playing. I think he made it 9 times, first team all-defense.
And
so he's always been wanting.
Right.
In other words, we know Rick Carlisle offense, most efficient offense of all time. Jason Kidd got that team that Rick Carlisle left when he went to Indiana to commit to defense, go to the Western Conference Finals. In other words, Jason Kidd knows how to coach defense because he did it after they traded Porzingis for Spencer Dinwiddie and crew. Next thing you know, they make the Western Conference Finals. They have the 3rd best defense from January 22 all the way to the Western Conference Finals. So he can do it. So has he lost his touch? That's the question.
Well, I mean, what we're looking at is a team that's not progressing defensively. And I understand you can say, all right, there's been some shifts. They're trying to figure some things out. And I think there is something fair there. This is where I bring up the second point. And this is the point that's been frustrating to me personally, is Jason Kidd in some ways. I know that you like quoting this, and I think a lot of us, point to it because Jason Kidd has said it time and time again, that he likes to say that the best defense is their offense.
No, their best defense.
Their best defense.
Not the best defense. Because that's the way this team is constructed.
Thank you. Thank you for making that clear. I really sincerely do appreciate that. And what he is saying is not necessarily we just got to outgun these teams, right, as it would maybe seem. He's saying there's a clear difference in effort and energy and execution with this team when they are making shots as opposed to when they are missing them. Mm-hmm. The problem is you've been having that conversation for a long time. And I mean, quite literally, that's been happening since last season. This particular conversation of the ways in which the defense does not show up in the way, and that you need to get effort and you need to get buy-in and guys need to do. And I wonder, how long do we wait for that message to land for a coach, right? If you were having to tell me this for over a year, at some point I have to wonder if you are capable of doing that. And I understand you can point to the 22 season when they went to the finals. At what point do we look at that as maybe some level of anomaly as opposed to it's going to come back around? And that's the idea of progress. We haven't seen progress in that way. And I feel like you're starting to reach a tipping point where we're seeing games where I think it's reasonable to say that you might be outcoached, and the levels of progress aren't necessarily there in the particular area of discipline that your head coach is supposed to be in. And I think that ends up being frustrating. That, I think, puts him squarely in the place where we have to consider how effective are you being as a head coach for this team?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And I suggest those who are wanting the answers to these questions, pick up the latest piece by Tim Cato in The Athletic that he wrote today. He breaks down why the players on this roster cannot efficiently play defense. And it's not just the coaching, and what you're watching is Jason and the coaching staff trying every kind of rotation. They're giving opportunities to all these different guys to see what will work. And it has not worked the last 6 games. When they were on the 7-game winning streak, they actually had the top 5 defense. I mean, it was crazy. So in other words, they showed you that they could do it. It's not like they've never done it for 2 years. They actually, that one window, if you wanted to micromanage it, when everybody was happy and when all these national experts were saying, this is a dangerous team you better watch out for, that defense was top 5. And in 1 week, it was number 1. With that being said, in Cato's article, it shows physically, no matter what the coaches do, including Jason Kidd, it's harder for this team to play defense. And it's because of the offense. So when Jason Kidd says our best defense is our offense, here's the reason why. When the Mavericks are making their shots, they can get back on defense even better. And their defense is actually decent. And he's got the numbers in the article. When the Mavericks miss their shots, it's where the players are placed offensively that makes them struggle on defense. If you can look at a court, the Mavericks do not have better three-point shooters than they did 2 years ago. And they have worse since this trade because these two guys, PJ and Gaff aren't necessarily great 3-point shooters, but the 3-point shooters, the corner threes, they're away from the basket on the other end than other teams' quarter threes. If they weren't defenders, in other words, that's your best defenders, they're further away. When Luka drives to the basket, and let's say he doesn't get a call, or he misses his bunny shot, or he misses the layup, and he falls down on the ground, you've got two guys to defend. One of those guys' name is Kyrie Irving. He is 6'2", and he's not known to be a lockdown D. You follow what I'm saying? If he was Drew Holiday, you might have a chance, but he's not. So their offense, if their offense is going, they have a better opportunity to get back on defense. And if they're missing their shots and these guys are in the corners, who's getting the rebounds? You see what I'm saying? It's a conundrum, but it's up to the coaching staff to figure it out. What you've been watching on this road trip, and they've come back for the last two, they were thinking the home games could allow them to fix some of these things. And it hasn't happened, which has increased more pressure on the coaching staff and the players, because they're like, they even did a film study. They were like, we had a film session that was very positive. We showed guys where they need to be. And it didn't change the outcome because the Pacers whooped them.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying about kind of the mechanics of sometimes, especially being a jump shooting team at times, when you're missing, that it can be tough in transition. That'd be some level of explanation if in half court they looked really good, or some level of good in defense. Even in half court, it doesn't look great.
That's where those rotations come in by.
Right.
And that's why. And see, here's part of it. Like you mentioned, some people are like, how come Gafford wasn't getting a lot of minutes the other games and on the road? Well, he's a drop 5. He's not a guy that guards the perimeter very well. Guess who was lighting up the perimeter? How about Trinity's own Miles Turner? You follow what I'm saying? But Gafford had a hell of a good game last night. Didn't miss a shot and was blocking shots, and he was all over the place. And you were asking about Lively last night. Lively got into foul trouble early the last 2 games. He had 2 quick fouls called on him on both games. And as a rookie, you know he's going to draw these fouls. And Gafford was playing well. So for those
he did finish the game though with only 3 fouls,
yes, he did.
So I that made me ask the question. Does he not get back involved?
But guess what?
Right,
Gafford was having a hell of a game. You're going to bench the guy who's having a hell of a game?
Gafford played 21 minutes. He didn't play in abundance of minutes either.
They're doing the rotations.
I think PJ Washington ended up playing a lot of, and so I will give him it seems like they were throwing out some more things.
You have to watch the game the whole way. I'm not saying you're wrong because you're trying to do a show at the same time. But for those who are like, how come you just look at the box score? Not you, people who are just looking at the box score. How come Lively didn't play? Lively got into foul trouble. People didn't know that. And they said, we only wound up with 3. Guess what? The other guys were doing some things. You have to look at the flow of the game and say, this is what happened. And you don't know this. Not you. I'm talking about people who just look at numbers. It's kind of like people who watch the Cowboys Green Bay game in the playoffs and say, I don't know what people mad at Dak. Dak, look at his numbers. He had a hell of a game. Those garbage minutes. You have to watch the game to know that Dak didn't help them the second half.
So I hear what you're saying, right? There's context to all of this, but ultimately, like at some point we have to get to brass tacks. Mm-hmm. And as much as we can say, hey, and I don't want to make this as much an indictment of this game in particular. I really want to take this wider, but even in this game, if the idea is, hey, there were some guys that were doing things, ultimately you look at the results, and the Pacers scored pretty consistently in every quarter all the way through that game. And so it feels like there's a lot of times where you can have some reasonable questions about rotations, about, like, when I talk about rotation, I mean like playing time and those types of things, the defensive standard. And then also Nick Angstadt, Locked On Mavs, did an interesting kind of study of the way that this team has just gone on runs up and down all the way through the season. And that's another thing that makes me go, where is the stabilizing force? And if I look at what I envision a head coach to do, there's so many of the things that we view as a head coach's responsibility that I look at and I go, I'm not sold that those things are happening at the level that it feels like it's suitable for the expectations, to go back to the word, of a team of where you want this team to be. So yeah, it feels like he's squarely in the hot seat. Now, I don't know. There's definitely some people that are like, yo, fire him into the sun right now. Bring in Mike Budenholzer or what have you. I don't know. I don't think that would be a productive exercise in this moment. But these final 20 games, I think that it is very, like, there's going to be a very, very strong microscope on what Jason Kidd does.
It's fair to say you got to kick the tires and see what happens.
And so the idea that, hey, man, Jason Kidd, he gets along well with these guys, that keeps them in focused with your team, Kyrie Irving in particular, as Luka Doncic is here. I feel like he's probably a little bit more amicable to just the general idea of being with the Mavs. It feels like Kyrie Irving has a little bit more attachment to that head coach. Honestly, for me personally, I'm at a place where that be damned. If we're not seeing enough of progress all the way around over the last 20 games, the last quarter of this season, I think Jason Kidd could be done here in Dallas. And that feels wild to say because there's definitely been ups over the course of this. But he's under a microscope now, especially when you look at the way that the defense is played, and that's one of his focuses.
It's one of the things you have to keep in mind as we all look at these last 20 games. And again, there's a lot of pressure on all the people, on the basketball side. They're getting this thing right. But you got to keep in mind the context of the entire season. It's kind of like, why is Luka not in the MVP conversation when he carried a team that was mostly injured? Oh, we didn't know they were injured. If you look at the numbers, you see that Luka has been exceptional, but he's not in the conversation. So you got to look at the whole context, and you remember these words from Mark Cuban when people were wanting to get rid of Jason Kidd last summer. He said, what kind of owner would I be if I'm running through head coaches every other year? You can't get the great coach if they don't feel secure to come here. So he says you got to let things play out. So you got to let these 20 games play out before you say, well, this is what happened. I mean, if Luka were to get hurt these last 20 games, are you still firing Kidd? You got to let these things play out. You can own, in other words, people want to deal in absolutes all the time. It's a what have you done for me lately or instant gratification world. So you literally have to painfully let it play out. It's almost like the Rangers last season. Back in September, it was like, I can't believe they lose these 6. They win 5 and they lose 6. Oh my God. All they had to do was win the last game of the regular season. They win the division. They lose 1-0. You got to let it play out. It's kind of like the Cowboys, 12-5. Guess what? Let's see how you play against Green Bay. Got to let it play out.
And similarly to,
I'm talking about on both ends, both extremes. You got to let it play out.
And similar to the way that I think people criticize the Cowboys, if you look at the last stretch of games, against bad teams and maybe mediocre teams in some ways, they've fared well. Against some teams that have the capability of really attacking your weaknesses, they have struggled. And so they're gonna have to show the fan base in particular something here soon.
It's like during that 7-game winning streak, everybody just forgets. Oh, they destroyed Oklahoma City in that stretch. What? The Cleveland game when they lost. Man, they should have beat Cleveland. Did you see what Cleveland just did to Boston? Everything is context, but people want to say, oh, that's excuses. It is what it is.